So we've had 3 conversations, and those conversations and dialogues have really challenged us to look at our space differently and incorporate care into it. I think we are trying to have more than a dialogue. We're just trying to be very much challenged and to change the status quo in terms of how the economic system is structured. And it starts with us. We're having these conversations. So we were challenged to make these spaces more... So we were challenged to make this space filled with care. Like the title is Economy is Care. And one of the ways in which we spoke, we thought about, and which affected us, the people who actually work here, the people who are here every Sunday, leaving our families, traveling from close and far, and just leaving them to come talk about the economy that's care. And we leave ourselves, we leave our responsibilities to come here and discuss this. And I think being in this space made us just think about, how do we do that differently? How do we incorporate the whole of ourselves in this space while having excellency in the conversation, integrity in the conversation, but also just caring about the people who are coming here, the people who are working in this space as well? Because so many times you find activists being activists outside. You know, you find an activist speaking about the HIV crisis or teenage crisis. Meanwhile, they leave their family, and these type of issues affect them personally. We couldn't have a conversation, a series of the Economy is Care conversation, without talking about who owns the currency, who owns the money. And it is very important to have had this technical discussion, make it more accessible to the layman people like us. It was very important to bring in the monetary policy, which is for us a very difficult subject, but it's a very important subject if you're going to be talking about the economy.
I think it was a fascinating discussion where people are reimagining what monetary policy can do to be able to serve the public good in terms of creating an economy, a caring economy, creating an economy that serves the people, an economy that grows and creates jobs for the majority of the South Africans here. Yeah. And a broader definition of what monetary policy is, beyond setting interest rates, because central banks throughout the world have had other functions over the past centuries. And obviously we discussed the issues of the ownership of the Reserve Bank, which my friend Gumani, Dr Tshimomola, will talk about, and also issues of the mandate of the Reserve Bank, and also issues of the independence. Can it be independent of our national goals?
So the Reserve Bank affects each and every person's life in this country, but at the same time, even outside the country, given the fact that we're in a monetary union, Eswatini, Namibia, and Lesotho are also, in a sense, affected by the activities of the Reserve Bank. So, yeah, it's a very, very important institution, and I think the expectation is that it should do more, given the poverty that we have, the unemployment that we have, inequality, the cost of living. Yeah, it can do a lot more, but I'm afraid it doesn't seem to be doing what all of us think or wish it should do.
So this one was very, very different in that the panel was all male, and ironically enough, all the discussion was very much about policy, very much about party politics. And in fact, one of the things that was mentioned is that party politics are the intellectual to be, and I was like, okay, cool. I don't so much agree with it, but that was what was said. So, yeah.
Now, I want to really say that this is really becoming the place to be on selected Sunday afternoons. And I was thinking about it this morning. If this was Cape Town, you wouldn't be here. You'd be chilling at the beach or on the mountain. But here in the City of Gold, we've kind of got to make our own chill. So I think the creative spirit of music, of theory and intellectual challenges, and also the food is something which we trust will give you the kind of atmosphere that you want to call home. So the idea behind this collaboration of partners, which includes Oxfam South Africa and New Economies Hub, and the hosts of each of our discussions, is to shift and shape basic narratives around the economy that have become pretty entrenched. The way in which the financialization of our economies has become the dominant priority against which politicians, the private sector, and even sometimes ourselves judge the well-being of our country. GDP growth, credit rating agencies, repo rates and interest rates become the discourse, rather than voice, agency, solidarity, hope, and happiness. Globally, we are also in strange times, in troubled waters, between rocks and hard places. And nationally, we've got looming local government elections. We've got national leadership failings, we've got corruption, we have assassinations, and we have suspensions. We have the greatest inequality globally and the second highest unemployment rate. Growing hunger, we have stunting amongst our children, despite what we are being told about having the best social security system in the world. We have alienation and atomization. We have autarky and not community. And so we collectively and very intentionally have designed a time and a space outside of these troubles, a time to shake out our existential beings and to hear, to think, to taste and to feel new, renewed and anew. In this series, we have sought to find some answers to our challenges. What if the economy was designed to care for our people, our nation and our continent, rather than for the profit of elites? What if our policies were crafted to meet the greatest level of well-being of people, a decent life, not the greatest unsustainable consumption growth? What if we measured our worth by the degree by which we have decreased inequalities, whether they're income, wealth, gender, race, spatial location, or increased decent work? We need to look at our needs differently. The global north is shedding jobs because they have an aging population. They're using technology because they don't have young people. We have young people but because we've been following the ways of working of the global north, we've been shedding jobs, which has led to a 78% unemployment rate for under 24-year-olds. In this series, we have looked at a new care economy, an inclusive economy. We've heard about why budgeting should and can be different, and we've heard great consensus about why we can and should tax more and better. Today, we'll hear about monetary policy. So before I start, three things. Firstly, you might notice that we have what I've been told is a manual. And Duma will mention the fact that it's not because we haven't invited women. It's just that women were not able to attend today. I think, Duma, maybe if you can mention the Reserve Bank's response as well, that would be very indicative of why we don't have women on the panel. Duma has spent more than 2 decades as a financial journalist, analyst, researcher, and advisor on issues of economic development and transformation. He went to school at Waterford Kamhlaba School in Eswatini and went and schooled at Aberdeen University in Scotland, where he got his master's in economics. He was also a research fellow at the Social Policy Initiative, let me check my own, and has published 3 papers around UBI, and 1 is about to be published. So watch out for that, if I can do a kind of side punt for that. He was also the editor of the book Making Mistakes, Righting Wrongs, Insights into Black Economic Empowerment, which reviewed the country's economic development and transformation policies during the first decade of democracy. In 2022, the BE Commission gave him a Spearhead Award for his work in this area. He's worked for numerous organizations, both in the public and private, and including NEPAD, COSATU, the COSATU Panel of Progressive Economists, and as a board member of Naledi. He's also a Business Day and Mail and Guardian columnist, public speaker, and commentator. Before I call Duma, I'm also going to call Dean to come up. But just in closing on the introduction to Duma, to say that Duma and I have worked together for a number of years.
Can I just say thanks to Oxfam and New Economy Hub for organizing this amazing event. I've attended 2 of them, and it's a truly special place. I apologize to Fezoguse. I'm shocking on responding to emails, to Pamelo and Isabel. But thank you for making this happen. Thank you so much for coming to me. I tried to get, late in the day, I realized it'd be really odd to have this discussion without the Reserve Bank. So I reached out to the governor and I said, Governor, this is the situation and these are the people that we're bringing in. And he says, yeah, we're going to have a meeting on Monday. We're going to discuss this. And then the letter came, I think, was it this week? It said, Dear Duma and Isabel, thank you for providing the details of the discussion and the panelists for Sunday afternoon conversations. We have considered your request again and decline your invite to participate in the conversation. The issues outlined in the document for the session, including nationalization, mandate, and independence of the SARB, are matters which we believe would be best dealt with by political parties through parliament or commentators which you have on your panel. As an independent institution, we do not discuss policy documents or policy positions of any political party on any platform. You're not allowed to respond to that. So we've got Buddy Wells, we've got Dr. Tshimomola, and Reg here. I'll start with you, Buddy. Buddy's a saxophonist and a public commentator on economics. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you have this combination of economics and the late Morabo Morojele was a drummer who had also studied a postgraduate degree in economics at the ISS, my friend. And he's a very eclectic person. How did you come about to have these two interests? Yeah.
Basically, so I was a teenager in the 90s, and I, when the transition to the new South Africa happened, I was very excited about what was going to happen. And then when it got to around about 2000, I started realizing that really nothing's changed in the economy. There's nothing, sure, politically there's been a change, but in most people's lives, there's still massive inequality, unemployment, poverty, and that kind of thing. And I was trying to understand why that was. So I started researching and basically went down the rabbit hole. And I started to realize that a lot of the economics that we get kind of force-fed through our media and through our, what we call our intellectuals and our academics and stuff, is very different to the economics that is used in, or that people are taught in economies that are actually successful. And so I started looking into that, and basically that's how I got more and more into economics. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Buddy. Dr. Gumani, he's the parliamentary researcher for the EFF. Recently, I had to facilitate a debate in Cape Town between the political parties, and he's done his doctorate on national treasury. Gumani, how did you become interested in these? I was gossiping with him about him with a friend of mine, Ben, and I was telling him that Ben says, since Floyd left the EFF, it's created a, sort of people have come out at the EFF, younger people who, quite frankly, to me, are making more sense than the people who were there before. And I think the EFF did amazing work on the budget this year. It was very busy for most of us, 3 budgets, and he kept me briefed on the issues throughout that drama that we saw over this past year. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the invite. Well, I'm not going to respond to the governor's letter, okay. Since it's an instruction, and I'm going to ignore the Floyd comment because I still need to drive home from here. I live in Pretoria, so for that reason. But most people don't know that I worked for the National Treasury.
Yes.
My first internship in 2009, on the 5th of Jan. That was my first working day as an adult. So I go to the National Treasury, the old Reserve Bank building is in 40 Church Square. So when you enter the building, because it's an old bank, it's very quiet and it's well polished. They still have, there's the flowers obviously, but they still have those counters. When you go to a bank in the olden days, you have counters. And I thought I was lost. I mean, imagine a 19-year-old, you're starting your internship. I was very early. I was there, I think, around 7. because I didn't want to miss it, And then, after 5 years there, it dawned on me that actually people don't know what the Treasury does, but it has a fundamental impact on basic things. The cost of bread, transport, and there are influential people behind that, decision makers, technocrats, who decide on serious things, and no one knows about it. You will not find a PhD thesis on the Treasury. Well, mine, it's a very modest contribution to a very broad subject. These interests started there, like 15 years ago. And when I was working there and I said I want to do a PhD on this subject, there was no interest at all to fund it, to support it financially. And as a result of that, I realized that I may have to do it, but outside the National Treasury. And then in that project of the role of the Treasury in South African political economy, then I got to realize that, so they're building blocks. The National Treasury, the Reserve Bank, the banks themselves, the IMF, the World Bank. And we have to understand these institutions, but not only just in South Africa, but globally. What role do they play, And of course, being in the EFF helped a lot. I've been in Parliament for the past 10 years now as a researcher. And the job of a researcher is that you don't have to be known. Like, Floyd has to be known. He's a politician, he throws bottles at people. So I've had the privilege of not having to lift up that weight, but I just read, write, and engage Duma on the side, and Ben and everyone else. So that's how this came about. It's not so much of a personal interest, but it's a professional journey that I had to go through, studying at the Treasury, asking questions, and no one was willing to answer them, and appreciating that there are people who were there since 1993, and they were still there 2015, even today. The law says you must retire at 65. Anyone else comes 65, you're out of the system. But these people don't leave the Treasury. They stay there. And that's why we must ask these questions. The context of the letter, it's important because it's part of what we're going to discuss here. But why it's important is because there could be an argument that can be made that, well, it's a private company. You send them an invite, you invite them, and as a private, unlike the public protector, maybe if you invite the public protector or the AG, they can't just say no. They may have to give you a good reason why, because they must account to the public. But the governor, well, I'm sorry, Duma, but you asked your director of a privately owned company to join you for a Saturday afternoon, and they all refused. And for that reason, I think that's why we must have this conversation.
Thank you. The comrade from Judges Matters here. Okay, Reg is currently the Chief Economic Advisor for the African Union and the UN's Coalition for Dialogue on Africa. 2 weeks ago, I was at an amazing conference at Boksburg, which brought together some of the best thinkers in the global South on issues of economic development. So Reg, how did you become interested in these topics?
Yeah, almost like Buddy. I come from the accounting and economics background. And what puzzled me as I was doing economics was this issue of money. We could hear almost every single newspaper saying, government has no money. Government has no money. So at some point in time, before I became a bit mature, I asked my parents, I said, is money created by God? That, there's just no money at all times. So when I went to read economics, I realized that they had theories that talk to money and why money is so scarce in society. And, so the interest grew even more to say, no, it can't be just correct. If money, somehow government prints it, or is created by government, that money is scarce. And we have so much poverty around. So I moved away from the traditional economics to what we now call heterodox economics, precisely to understand why there's always a story in the newspaper or by politicians and so on, why there's no money. and countries are poor, you know, and roads are not there, hospitals are crumbling, and so on. So those were the questions that drove me to this issue of money and obviously macroeconomics generally. So yeah, so Duma, the conference that we had last week that were there was to address the same issues pertaining to how we can reorganize the global South. From the current challenges that we all experience, whether it's in Latin America, here in Africa, and Asia, we have similar challenges. So scholars from all over came to talk to each other and the audience, and again puzzle over the issues of money. Believe me now, as I say, that some scholars today, as I speak, do not comprehend the issue of money. And indeed, not long ago, a teacher at Harvard, his name is Professor Gqubule, did write saying the discipline of money or the field of money is the most complex in economics. And I did indeed understand why he says that. I do understand right now why it is indeed very complex. So I'm glad we're here talking about the Reserve Bank and perhaps the Treasury, all right? Because they're brothers. So they're actually one in a way. Yeah. One is a desk of the other, but they've created what they call independent Reserve Bank, stuff like that. So yeah, I'm here so that we can discuss these interesting issues and whether indeed we can provide some, not all, solutions to the challenges that confront Pretoria.
Thank you so much. I just have to say that I think Buddy and yourself were saying something that I found is that you have to unlearn a lot of the things that we learned at university, since we worked. And that has happened to me, and issues about whether it's money, whether it's this artificial separation between... Busi was saying to me when I came to her thing that she was hosting, this one of yours and mine should have been combined. And I've always believed that fiscal policy and monetary policy is the same thing. But let's start off with the easy one, and the Reserve Bank nationalization. So if the last time I looked, before I talked to the governor, I think 2 weeks ago, there is 5 million shares worth 2 rands each. The Reserve Bank is worth 10 million rands. To nationalize, that is a third of the price of Paul Mashatile's house. So to nationalize the Reserve Bank would cost 10 million rands. There's an anomaly of private ownership. There is 7 central banks in the world that have got some private ownership. Of those 7, 5 of them have got a mix of public and private ownership. There's only 2, South Africa and the US, that have got 100% private ownership. So there is an anomaly. So I'll ask Gumani, the EFF has introduced a bill in Parliament. He gave me a spreadsheet of some of the reasons that people gave not to nationalize the Reserve Bank. I think about 2 years ago, before he became deputy president, Paul Mashatile was saying in the Mail and Guardian, it would cost billions of rands to nationalize the Reserve Bank. So I was angry. I called him. How can you say this? It's so like it's the easiest thing to do. So Gumani, why do politicians lie and say that it will cost billions of rands to nationalize the Reserve Bank when it is the easiest thing to do?
Well, yeah. Politicians must answer that one. It's a good thing you introduced me here. But look, the logic that the EFF has on the nationalization question, and there's things that we agree on, all of us, or most of us at least. We agree that, firstly, the mandate and the function of the central bank is a public function. You will find very few people who disagree with that point, right? But also we agree that as an institution, the South African Reserve Bank is privately owned. You will not find anyone who disagree with that. Maybe he may disagree with me on that one, and he explains it. But the private ownership of the South African Reserve Bank, it's an anomaly, and I agree with Duma on that one, right? That's not how things are done in most parts of the world. But the second thing is that we didn't end up with a private ownership out of an accident. So there was a deliberate intention to structure and formulate the South African economy in a particular way for certain interest. And if you go to the Constitutional Assembly transcripts, so this will fall under theme 6.2 that dealt with public institutions that deals with money and public enterprises. It was chaired by Rob Davis, Dr. Rob Davis, the former Minister of Trade and Industry. So if you go through those transcripts, there's about 14 of them. These are meetings that happened from 1995 January up until they finalized the constitution, right? There's only one person who asked in those meetings, was a member of the National Party, and asked whether are we going to, at some point, link, obviously building up from the interim constitution, link the functions that were outlined in the interim constitution of 1993 with the question of whether the Reserve Bank, number one, will remain privately owned, but number two, if it's privately owned, do we link it then with fiscal policy? And it was the ANC that rejected that. It was not the National Party. The National Party asked the question, but the ANC rejected it. So we have to rely on that history as to why there's a privately owned South African Reserve Bank. But why it's important to perhaps talk about why we should move away from it is because it may look like a small conversation in the broader scheme of things. But there is an idea at the moment that monetary policy is actually not a sovereign public thing. It's a private thing. Is the Monetary Policy Committee, is the Reserve Bank and the team there, and the financial sector in the main way have interest in it. But the truth, we all have interest in it. Traditional leaders have interest in it. Civic society, academia, and this is truly a public function. So why do you have a public function that is placed in the realm of private ownership? It doesn't make sense. Then the EFF says, look, we don't change the constitution to broaden the mandate at the moment, right? We leave the constitutional clause as it is. But there's a quick win that we can all advance this conversation. We can move a step forward. Can we start with at least fixing the anomaly of getting rid of the private ownership aspect? Let the state hold all the shares that are there, and the amount that Duma is referring to is absolutely correct. Even in the worst case scenario, by the way, we're not looking at anything more than 30 million, right? Doesn't matter what calculations anyone brings about. Even the Treasury can bring you more than 30 million in their calculations. Once we have dealt with that aspect of ownership, then we can continue with the conversations that are happening. They are not new conversations, by the way. There are people who had this conversation with much more nuanced understanding in the early 90s. One of the people who stand out in most of this conversation is Pillay, Vela Pillay. So the communist comrade comes from the Bank of China. He comes back through the communists. He plays some role in the ANC through some formation of a structure there. He was very clear and he articulated what should be the position of the Reserve Bank for the entire liberation movement. But he was defeated. So we need to solve the problem of ownership first. It's not like we can't do both things at the same time. We can talk about the mandate and the function of the Reserve Bank, the independence, but at the same time, we're going to resolve the question of ownership. We didn't think it was going to be that political at first because there was a resolution of the ANC, which was taken by conference in 2017, which says that we must nationalize the Reserve Bank, right? So the EFF says we're helping you in that aspect. Since you are busy with all other legislation, we will table this one. Because it's a minor amendment to the South African Reserve Bank Act. Because we just have to go, and where it says ownership and shareholding, we remove issuing of shares so that no one in the public can have access to the shares. And then we just put all the shares for the Minister of Finance to be the one who represents the state. Like how it's written for the PIC Act. No one can buy PSE shares because PSE is essentially owned by the state. All the shares are owned by the state. So it's that small amendment that has been stuck in Parliament since 2018. And it's not moving even to this point. And the reason why it's not moving, if we don't have the ANC buy-in on that South African Reserve Bank Amendment Bill, you are just going to fight and force it, and then they'll reject it. And it's going to be a lose. So we've been trying, engage them on the side, negotiate, hoping that at some point there may be a politically conducive environment where we get to get rid of the private ownership of the bank and then get the bank in as a public institution, not currently as a private institution. So if you go to the PFMA at the back, there's a technical annexure there where we list all state-owned institutions, at least for national, provincial, and municipalities, but not their extension, like not their subsidiaries, but the main one. The Reserve Bank is not there. That's why you can invite them today and they don't come and there's nothing you can do about it.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of sitting down with Vela Pillay. What an intelligent person. And these are some of the things that got lost in our transition from, to democracy, people like that. Buddy, quickly, before we move on to other things. Yeah. Why do politicians lie and say it will cost billions of rands to nationalize the Reserve Bank?
When it comes to monetary policy and what politicians say, I can only assume that one is that they don't really know what's going on and they think they're telling the truth, or that there's some kind of corruption going on. That's the only kind of, that can be the only two options. As far as the shareholders go, what other private company does all the profit get paid to government? What other private company does the majority of the board be appointed by the president of the country? I understand that on paper it looks like it's owned by private shareholders, and I'm completely for nationalization of the South African Reserve Bank. But the whole thing is just kind of like it's almost like an illusion that's been created. And it's very easy, as Gumani says, to change that. It's just the South African Reserve Bank Act can amend it. But for me, that's not really the issue, because what the real issue is political will. Because we can change the shareholders, we can nationalize the bank. But as long as the people in government don't direct the Reserve Bank to implement policy that benefits the majority of South Africa instead of a few people, then it's going to be the same thing. And there's nothing actually in the Constitution that prevents government from doing that. The South African Reserve Bank mandate is balanced. The end goal is balanced and sustainable growth. And there are many ways that the South African Reserve Bank can be directing the monetary supply. So
when you were talking, I think it made sense. It's either they don't know what they're doing, or it reminds me of when I published that book so it explained that in 1996, when the government had gear, there was no debt crisis, but people believed that there was a debt crisis. So the publisher, Mwele Tsimbeki, was convinced. He says, but Duma, then why did they do it? So I said, well, the charitable thing is that they didn't know what they were doing. I read your brother's paper, State and Transformation, and I concluded that he didn't know what he was doing. So he says, did money change hands? So it can be one of the two. Let's just finish off with this one. Yeah. Reg, then before we come to the more difficult issues here that you were talking about.
Yeah. I first indicated that a teacher at Harvard said money is the most complex field in economics, not just for politicians, but for scholars as well. Unfortunately, I see one scholar outside, a teacher of economics. He could perhaps attest to that. Now, with regard to South Africa, there's a great deal of ignorance in regard to the role of a reserve bank. A great deal of ignorance, it seems to me, about money itself. And therefore, there's this confusion. But who brings the confusion to the ANC when, in fact, the majority of the ANC members out there say we want to nationalize this thing? It seems the leadership of the ANC is not interested in that. So something is really happening to those leaders. Because I think intuitively they know that it's quite important to nationalize the Reserve Bank. But somehow they don't want to do that. So there ought to be, it seems to me, that they ought to be convinced by some people, being taught by some people, that they shouldn't nationalize. And guess what is actually quite common? It's all over the newspaper. The business people in this country do not like the Reserve Bank nationalized. And a great deal of the business people in this country, the business persons, are moneyed people, all right? And they've got lots of connections outside the country. Many European countries do not want the Reserve Bank to be nationalized. And they continually force this narrative that nationalization is bad. Yet virtually all economies in Europe have a nationalized Reserve Bank, apart from Italy.
Italy, yeah.
All right? So the question is, why should Europe be so interested in the story of South Africa nationalizing but opposing it when they themselves have their reserve banks nationalized? It's the issue of money. What nationalization is going to mean to South Africans in general, and how that may transform this economy. And I think it's part of this colonial issue, or shall we call it neo-colonial, Duma? That I think seems to be playing in the minds of so many commentators, including the IMF people, OECD, and so on and so forth. All of them, they're opposed to this idea of us nationalizing. But again, maybe the word nationalization is not very good. I've actually stopped using it because it confuses people. I actually say, let's put the Reserve Bank in democratic hands.
Yeah.
In other words, in the hands of the people. If it is not in the hands of the people, then it must be in the hands of someone. And who is that someone? Who are those people? Those are the persons who are essentially doing us a disservice and communicating with the vociferous business community here that doesn't want this Reserve Bank to be in the hands of the citizens.
Thanks. You know, when you were talking about the name, in a previous life, I was the go-to person on mining. And when I looked into the issue, I said, yeah, we must have state ownership of the mines. And I remember Bridget Motsepe says, you know, when we talk nationalization of the mines, it scares people. It thinks they're going to come after my house, my car, my wife, and my children. So why don't we call it something else? So yes, anyway, now the second issue, what is monetary policy and why is it so important? Is the Reserve Bank the most important institution in the economy? Now, if you look into history, no, let's start with South Africa. The ordinary person thinks the central bank is there to set interest rates and almost very little else. It might be there to regulate the banking system, and these are the functions of the central bank. It does very little. But if you look through history, what central banks have done, they've financed governments, they've financed wars, they've financed industrial policies, they've financed social policies throughout history. And then there was a pause during the neoliberal era from the 80s where central banks, had a different character, where you had independent central banks. And then fast forward to the global financial crisis, there was a lot of central bank intervention in the bond markets, what we call the purchase of government bonds on the secondary markets. These are government bonds that are already traded, yeah. And then fast forward to COVID, which is more interesting, is that the stimulus packages during COVID were about 17 trillion rands, according to the IMF. 12 trillion was financed by the big five central banks. The US central bank, the Fed, $4.4 trillion. The European Central Bank, 4.4. The Bank of Japan, 1.2. People's Bank of China, 0.9. And the Bank of England, 0.7. 12 trillion rands that they printed for their people to make. Now, if you look at what the US Fed, the home of capitalism, I was just looking, they actually paid people to stay at home. Yeah. They paid businesses to be able to pay people. They paid small businesses. They put money into municipalities. They supported non-governmental organizations. There's so many things that the central bank, this is now, I'm not talking about many years ago, they put money. I remember reading that the People's Bank of China financed the setting up of hospitals during COVID. Do you see what I'm saying? So we have this view that monetary policy is just about interest rates. But if you look at history, central banks have done more. And then the last thing I want to say is that in 2024, the central bank in South Africa gave Treasury 150 billion rands to pay the debt. I phoned the governor. I said, please explain what happened. It was ostensibly because there was a surplus on the government and foreign exchange reserve account. But once you look at what actually happened, they never touched our foreign exchange reserves. There was a surplus of 500 billion rands, but they never touched our foreign exchange reserves of 1.2 trillion. So they created monopoly money. That's all that happened. The sky did not fall. Let's go back to COVID. March 2020, there is a huge dislocation in financial markets around the world. And $100 billion exits emerging markets. And there's a dislocation here in South Africa. Our interest rates went up through the roof. And guess what happens? The central bank bought existing bonds, limited purchases of bonds. They intervened in the market and they created order. And the cost of capital went down by about 300 basis points. That happened now. Do you see what I'm saying? These are things that happen now. These are not things that are crazy. So about 20 emerging markets, they did the same during the pandemic, from Indonesia to other ones. So what is monetary policy? I'll start with Reg, because he talks a lot about this. It's an interest rate policy, is not monetary policy. Reg, yeah.
Yeah, well, that the Reserve Bank practices, in my view, is an interest rate policy, not necessarily the monetary policy. Of course, the interest rate component of monetary policy is there, but fundamentally what we have here is a Reserve Bank using interest rate to dial up or down, the inflation, which says causes lots of challenges. And that has been the story, and it continues to be the story. But this thing comes from somewhere. It's not just a desire by the Reserve Bank to do that. It comes from the mandate of the Reserve Bank. All right? Maybe if we start from there, maybe then come down to why this interest rate policy, instead of the full-blown monetary policy, which is rather complex, in my view. I know maybe somewhere there you said you're going to ask us to discuss the mandate. But maybe it is important that we start from here as we begin to explain why the interest rate policy. The mandate of the Reserve Bank says something like it's there to maintain the value of the currency, all right, which is the rand. Now, there's an interpretation which says to maintain the value of a currency means price stability, stabilizing the prices. Actually, they're not the same. Okay, they're completely different. It's just that scholars here in the country and perhaps elsewhere have accepted the notion that price stability is exactly the same as maintaining the value of the currency. the value of the currency, the maintenance of the value of the currency such that it doesn't fall or whatever, it is a bit stable, talks to what would be seen as the unit of account. All right? So the rand is a unit of account. And in South African sense, to stabilize that unit of account, which is the currency, the key variable for that is the interest rate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And this also has gone as far as being taken for granted by so many people to thinking that price stability, which is not precisely the same as maintaining the value of the currency, has to have interest rate as the key variable. Again, the theories that talk to that, many of them in monetary policy. But so this key variable called interest rate is therefore the one that we are using in this country to stabilize. But quite frankly, you cannot just stabilize the rand, the currency of the value of the rand, using interest rate. You have to have exchange. I mean, you have to have exchange rate issues come into play, and many others. So when we talk about monetary policy, it certainly talks to a lot more than just what you have been trying to labor here, that is interest rate, it's interest rate, it's interest rate. That denies the country significant room to maneuver when it comes to developing the economy or financing the economy. Because then you're just using an interest rate. Now, again, the use of this interest rate, in my view, interest rates rather, can, to a good extent, be destabilizing. Very, very stabilizing, to the extent that you can have lots of macroeconomic challenges as a consequence of sticking to this particular use of this rate, of interest rates. So the discussion is big. I may come back to it to reflect deeper, but for now, I think there's that thought in the Reserve Bank, in the Treasury, and across the society that the key variable that has to be used to stabilize this currency is the interest rate, but also the mistake of assuming that price stability is precisely the same as maintaining the value of the rand.
Thanks, Reg. And while we're talking about interest rates, you learn at university that inflation is everywhere, and what's the saying? Everywhere and always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. There's too much money chasing too few goods and services. So interest rates address that situation. But in South Africa, since inflation targeting was introduced, we've never had that situation. Inflation, as Reg said in the book I recently, inflation is always been in South Africa a supply side problem. It's the oil price, the exchange rate, food prices, drought, foot and mouth disease. Now, you don't have to be an economist to be able to understand making us pay more for our bonds will not address foot and mouth disease. So what they've been doing for the past 25 years, to me, we'll come back to that. But now, Buddy, someone needs to explain to me, the government issues the currency. Historically, central banks have been supporting economic development. Why do we have to go and borrow the currency that we issue from third parties like the banks and the insurance companies? Why? This is the currency that we issue. Why do we have to go to Old Mutual, pay exorbitant fees, interest costs, when we can issue the money? Yeah.
Well, the short answer is that we don't, especially when inflation is cost pushed and demand for goods and services is too low. This is the question that I posed to Treasury at an online workshop a couple of weeks ago, and they just ignored it. I said to them, why, when inflation is too low, and when demand is too low, and costs are driving inflation? What stops Treasury from spending on things that are going to reduce our costs, like infrastructure, policing, education, healthcare, energy, and offsetting that spending less with taxes and high interest bond sales, which add to costs and reduce demand, and more with South African Reserve Bank credit. So in other words, money creation, which is going to add to demand and reduce costs. And they didn't answer the question. So there's no reason for that. And as Duma pointed out recently, when the South African when Treasury spent from the Jafeka account that's 100 billion last year, and I think it's 25 billion this year, 25 billion next year, so 150 billion in total from its Jafeka account. What that was basically just monetary finance by the Reserve Bank, and you can actually look at the banking reserves and see the immediate increase of 100 billion when they spent that last year, midway through last year. Bank reserves increased by 100 billion. And since then, the inflation has actually dropped to historical lows and remained at the lowest point that we've had inflation. And the government bonds yields dropped immediately by about around 2%.
The yield is the cost of capital. Yeah.
The interest rate that government pays on its long-term debt, and the rand actually got stronger against the dollar since then. So the idea that governments, we always get told that we can't finance government spending with South African Reserve Bank credit because it's going to create hyperinflation, and we've actually done that, and we've been doing that. And we had the lowest, and countries like Japan, who've financed 40% of their government debt. Government debt in Japan, by the way, is 270% of GDP. They've had the lowest inflation over the last 3 decades of any country in the world. So, that narrative really needs to be kind of examined and really killed, basically. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So yeah, it's very important that we kind of challenge these narratives, and even when government borrows from these institutions like the IMF, it actually ends up becoming money creation, because actually we were talking about it the other day. If you look at the banking reserves, since 2020, they've been going up even without that Jafeka spend. And part of what's causing the banking reserves going up is because the government was borrowing money from the IMF and from but borrowing forex denominated, so they're borrowing dollars. And then the South African Reserve Bank was buying those dollars from government, putting those dollars into the government's banking reserves, the forex reserves, and then government was taking the money that the South African Reserve Bank was buying the forex from them, the rands. It creates rands to credit government's account, and then government spends that money, and so it's creating rand. And the policy at the moment in the South African Reserve Bank is that whatever reserves get created above the required reserves, the South African Reserve Bank pays the repo rate on. So basically, when we're borrowing in forex from the IMF, and the South African Reserve Bank buys the forex from government and puts the forex in the reserves, and government spends the rands that's been created by that. It ends up being that the South African Reserve Bank ends up paying the repo rate on those created reserves, as well as the government paying interest on whatever it's borrowing in forex. So it's almost like a double interest payment happening, which actually is unnecessary because the South African Reserve Bank can really just, also with the Jafrek spend, the reserves that were created by that, the South African Reserve Bank could just raise the required reserve requirement so that the South African Reserve Bank doesn't actually have to sterilize those reserves by paying interest on them. And banks can't use those reserves because they're required, so they have to just hold them. They can't lend them out. So to other banks. And
Buddy, just back to the question.
Yes.
Why can't the central bank finance economic development? And why do we have to borrow the money that we issue from the banks and the old mutuals? Yeah. And for you and Gumani, just quickly, yeah. What is the reason? He was saying that when he grew up and he was told that there is no money, he started asking questions about the role of money. And that's what made him go to study this stuff. So what is the reason for why can't the central bank finance economic development? And it has been doing that for the better part of a century in all the rich countries and many of the developing countries. Yeah.
Well, it can. And it's just that's the thing, is that we're told that it's going to create hyperinflation. And the limit to what government can spend is inflation. That is true, but that really needs to be tested. Is how much we can spend and how quickly we can spend into the economy, how much government can spend into people's accounts, doing things that are useful for that we need, and that will drive demand up. Yes, it will. But there's a lot of space in the economy. There's a lot of unemployment. There's a lot of room for a little bit extra demand to actually drive investment, because what's happening at the moment is the private sector is not investing because the costs are too high. The demand is too low. And if government was spending on things that are going to reduce the cost and increase the demand, you're going to have the private sector incentivized to actually invest and employ people to meet the demand that's being created.
Yeah. I just want to ask the last question before we go out to questions to the audience, is that we are in an unprecedented economic crisis. If you had to look at the last 16 years, from 2009 to 2024, our economy has grown by 1.1% a year. That is, by comparison, 155 emerging and developing countries grew by 4.4% a year. They cruised to 4.4% a year without much effort. Emerging and developing Asia, 6.3%. That is a period that includes the global financial crisis and the shutdown of the world economy through COVID. Why can't South Africa? So this year, we will have GDP per capita declining. By the end of last year, GDP per capita was lower than it was in 2007. It will continue to decline this year. It will be 18 years of declining average living standards. Why is it that South Africa has had this chronic low GDP growth for so long? Over the same period, unemployment has increased by 6.7 million people. We now have 12.6 million unemployed people, the second highest unemployment rate, as she said, Isabel, after Eswatini. We've got the second highest youth unemployment rate after Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. We have a crisis, 42.9% unemployment. We have 51.4% for African women, 47% for Africans, and 71% for youth. We have an economic crisis. But what is the mandate of the central bank? It is to keep, they're now targeting 3% inflation, and then the Treasury is targeting a primary budget surplus of 2%. So nobody is responsible for growing this economy and creating jobs. How can the central bank, how can the most important institution and national treasury be independent of national goals? Gumani, yeah.
So,
yeah.
You asked both Reggie and Buddy two separate questions.
Yeah.
But essentially, at the core of that question is, why is the Reserve Bank not printing money to build schools?
Yes.
Hospitals, whatever infrastructure we need. And there is another simpler explanation but it has also a mathematical explanation in it. And the challenge with academia is that we need to be able to do academics but still have a conversation on a day-to-day basis in such a way that you don't have to explain what is yield.
What is
right? Yield.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But so that's the challenge. So I'm sitting and I'm looking at an academic outside, and it just reminded me. So the economy is structured for maximum profit making, right? And the policy of the state has to be designed around how can we maintain profitability? Meaning that how can SPAR, Pick and Pay, everyone else who's in manufacturing, financial sector banks, how can they operate and still make profit? That's currently the priority. Once the state functions in such a way that the private sector, when they operate business but don't make profit, then we all have a problem, right? Leave schools, leave hospitals, leave potholes, leave those things. In the 80s, the private sector has this challenge now that even their rate of profit now is no longer desirable. They are unable to maintain the level at which they make profit, right? So that becomes an issue, and apartheid becomes one of the areas that causes them not able to make profit. So if you reorganize the economy, part of it is political, meaning that do away with apartheid. And then obviously we'll go into the state, we'll go into the Reserve Bank and everyone else, so that we can go back to a level where we make profit. That becomes essential. Now, when you answer the question of why does the Reserve Bank not finance the state expenditure, the question then has to be responded in such a way that we say, can the Reserve Bank finance state expenditure and then the private sector still operate and make profit? Because there could be an argument that if you do that, the financial sector, which makes up about 23% of the GDP, meaning that we're all subservient to that sector. It was manufacturing at some point. They actually swapped now. So where manufacturing is at about 13%, that's where the financial sector was. But the financial sector is now at 23% of the GDP. And these guys record profits year in, year out. Even when the growth is very low, there's high levels of unemployment, there's crime, and the state is dysfunctional. But the banks are reporting profit, right? So if we can't finance state expenditure without affecting the profitability of the private sector, I think it would have happened a long time ago.
Gqubule, I think you're referring to finance.
Yeah.
And finance is not the economy.
No.
Yeah.
But there's an important part of it, because government remains largest spending item in the economy.
Yes.
Right? So you have to go back to financing where there could be maximum spending, which is in the state, not in the private sector.
Yes.
That's what government spend most in the economy. Everyone else is doing business with government.
Yeah.
Right? You will not find people who are profitable in a sense currently doing business and they're not tapping into the state supply chain.
Okay, sure.
Right? That's the point. So go to 1998. The former Minister of Finance, and this is the last point, Duma, the former Minister of Finance, Baron du Plessis, did an interview. It's recorded on O'Malley, the transcript. The question is asked, what you could have done better when you left government in 1994. 1996 was a different minister, Chris. Baron du Plessis lived in 1994. He said, I should have left South Africa with more international debt than domestic, because that would have locked us into a certain policy framework. Is there in writing? But the person who actually does that is Tito Mboweni when he became a Minister of Finance. So when you look at the period where Tito becomes the Minister of Finance, even the borrowing patterns start to change. So before, the foreign aspect of our debt was very low. It's still low compared to domestic.
Yeah.
But you could see a clear trend in the past 5 years or so. And the explanation is that after the Zuma moment, where Zuma literally attacked the Treasury, and not by some reckless interference, political and policy as a president. He says, let's fund these following things, right? wrong or right, we can debate the whole Gupta thing, which I don't think is the moment for it. But the president of the country says, let's fund the following things: free education, let's nationalize engine at the time and buy the certain infrastructure that will allow us to produce our fuel much cheaper. And then quite a number of things. Let's build a nuclear facility at whatever amount it was projected. But it is the Treasury that says, no, we can't do that. Mm-hmm. So there was a moment of vulnerability on the side of the Treasury during that period of changing of ministers,
Okay, sure.
different advisors.
Yeah.
And then that is why the important question here is so much, when you can't fund state expenditure using the Reserve Bank and monetary policy in its totality, can you do that and still have private sector that is profitable? And if the answer is no, then it's not going to happen.
Okay. Reg, quickly, before we...
Just two
question.
issues.
Yeah.
First is the framework that we use in the country for macroeconomics, the macroeconomic framework. It's so enslaving, so imprisoning, that it doesn't leave sufficient space for the economy to do what we would want to do. Second, why we cannot finance the Reserve Bank? The Reserve Bank Act has provisions in them that have essentially tied the Reserve Bank deliberately, all right? Tied the Reserve Bank in such a way that it cannot even, from its pockets, can't release money into the economy. You know, the loopholes that exist in there give you almost nothing, really, for the type of economy that we have if it were to be used. So there is a deliberate act from the way in which we have organized our economy, the macroeconomic framework, including the economic development model as a whole, is flawed, as it is the case with the Reserve Bank Act, very restrictive. Again, the very issue we mentioned earlier at the beginning, that some people somewhere have imposed on us the mechanics of how this economy ought to work. And the only time this economy is going to grow is when there's external demand, not internal demand. That's why you saw in...
That's their argument.
Yeah?
Is that their argument? The external demand?
Well, the way it is tied up, it's such
see.
that it leaves us with little, almost no room for internal, relaxation, if you want, including obviously the deliberate tying of the Reserve Bank Act, which says you can't finance state.
Buddy, last one? Yeah. Our economy is not growing. We've got this record unemployment. How can you have a central bank and a treasury that is independent of these national goals? In fact, as it stands now, there's nobody who's responsible for growing the economy and creating jobs.
Well, that's debatable, because the mandate of the Reserve Bank isn't just to preserve the value of the currency. The mandates of the Reserve Bank says to preserve the value of the currency in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth. And that is the very important part of its policy. In other words, the way that it preserves the value of the currency or protects the value of the currency must be done in a way that is in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth.
So they're ignoring the second part of the mandate.
People tend to ignore that, but that's the end goal.
Yeah.
So, there's no real... there's nothing stopping. It's just all that is political will at the moment in terms of the mandate of the Reserve Bank. And the Reserve Bank's second thing is it's independent, but it's also supposed to carry out its mandate without prejudice towards it's no fear or favor. So basically, it's not supposed to favor any particular kind of. And at the moment, its policy is definitely favoring the financial sector, as we said. Our monetary policy is monetary and fiscal policy basically is set up to limit the amount that government spends into people's accounts to the amount that government removes from people's accounts with taxes and with bond sales. So, in doing so, what that does is it makes the private sector completely dependent on
It makes us dependent on the private sector.
It makes the private sector, households and business, completely dependent on bank lending at high interest rates for any increase in money supply. So basically, the amount of money that we have in circulation in South Africa has got to support investment and growth and profit and incomes and all that kind of stuff. For the economy to grow and for investment to grow, the money supply has to support that. And so there is an increase in money supply, but it's only coming through bank lending at the moment at high interest rates. And we can actually increase the money supply at much less cost to all of us if government is spending at much lower interest cost into the economy.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys. I'm going to put questions to the floor. And to me, the priority is to grow this economy and create jobs. And I was talking to Begazeli from Judges Matter that the central bank is not like the judiciary. I don't think it can be independent of national goals. How can it be independent of our national goals? How can Treasury be independent of national goals? So can I have some questions from the floor?
Regarding the nationalization of the Reserve Bank, so my understanding from the discussion was that the EFF proposed a bill that it be nationalized. But he raised the point that the government already kind of appoints the people who run the Reserve Bank. So my question is, what is the goal of actually nationalizing the Reserve Bank? Why do we want to do it if the government is already calling the shots on what it does? That kind of indicates control and determines the policy anyway. So the only difference to me is where the profits of the actual Reserve Bank, who it goes to. So it's currently going to private shareholders.
It actually doesn't.
Oh.
It goes to government, yeah.
Okay, so even that. Okay, so it actually doubles down on the question then.
I think my issue was that why do they lie and say it will cost billions of rands? Can we please agree that it will not cost billions of rands? The nationalization, let's start with Gumani. I think just to answer on his basic, no, I won't answer on his, but the ownership, independence, and mandate of the Reserve Bank, these are separate issues, but I don't see why we can't do all of them at the same time. We have a US Fed that's got a dual mandate, maximum employment, jobs and growth. Jobs and inflation. So, yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. So for me, it's about the anomaly. It's not necessary to achieve any objectives, but it's an anomaly, and the politicians mustn't lie and tell us that it will cost billions of rands. They must give us the reason why they can't nationalize here. It is actually the easiest thing to do. Sorry, yeah.
My question has to do with, actually, there were quite a few questions posed during the discussion. And for me, it's like the fundamental issue is we're dealing with problems and trying to find solutions where actually in the system, in order to get somewhere, you have to exploit someone. So we're looking at the Chinese model where they've become big players in the global system because they're offering cheap labor. South Africa, within South Africa, is this what we're looking for? What are we hoping to achieve? Because it feels like in order to get somewhere, someone has to really do badly in order for us to succeed. But here we are, and I'm also questioning because I'm seeing posters saying think socialism, but I'm like, is that even enough? Because fundamentally we have a system that is built on exploitation, and whatever you say, maybe it's not maybe the Chinese model isn't based on that, but unfortunately, in order for us to get somewhere, someone has to be paid nothing. Even in America, all the labor is going to China. All of this is happening because someone somewhere is being paid next to nothing. How do we then resolve this? And also, is this what our goal is as South Africa? Is that what we want? We want to be the next global exploiter. Thank you.
Oxfam and the New Economy Hub, they want to create a new economy, a care economy, I think we have to talk about public ownership. We have to talk about public ownership of education, health. We have to talk about public ownership of electricity. We have to talk about subsidized mass housing. So I don't know. Has anyone got an idea about changing the structure of the economy so that it doesn't, exploit people? We have to talk about perhaps providing, in addition to universal basic income, a job guarantee that lifts, higher. There's been minimum wages in Mexico set quite high, very successful in terms of reducing inequalities.
My full name is Mbegazeli from Judges Matter. I have a rather naive question, which is about the nationalization of the Reserve Bank. I think if the frustration is about it not being aligned with national goals, will nationalization actually achieve that? Because state ownership seems an obvious and attractive prospect, but as Buddy Wells says, if the political will behind that is not aligned with those national goals, does it actually get us there? I ask this because, for example, the PSL, which runs the National League, is essentially a private entity that runs our National Football League. I have deep problems with that. I think it should be nationalized, especially to protect the players who are playing in football. But it doesn't stop it from running football games. I mean, yesterday Orlando Pirates won, and so it's so nationalization seems to be an important thing to do, but fundamentally, does it actually address what needs to be done? Because the National Soccer League, the courts have said it's a private entity carrying out public functions. So it is bound to the strictures of every other public entity. But I know that the players in the PSL are not treated well. And so I would prefer that it be nationalized. So what does nationalization fundamentally do for the man on the street if the political will doesn't exist? If we're saying that the political will to align with national goals is not there, does nationalization get us there? And on this question of independence, obviously independence is a contested terrain, and I think we should debate it and we should question it, and as we are doing so in the judiciary. But I think that we should also, and I haven't, maybe I'm ignorant, but in this conversation I haven't heard what is the benefit, where does this independence question lie when the National Reserve Bank is nationalized? Where does that independence, is it affected in any way? Is it not affected? Why does it matter?
On the nationalization, and I said it's beyond symbolism, the function of the Reserve Bank at the moment, there are people who feel like it's their own thing in the main. And this is the financial sector, white, privately owned money space in South Africa. It's almost like black people have no share in it, right? We're spectators in this economy. And the Reserve Bank is aiding that spectatorship position, almost displaced out of the conversation, including by people who you would have thought that because they're deployed there by, for example, the ANC, they will go there and think about the ANC constituency in the main. What should a monetary policy look like? But no, instead you have some fight back, like serious fight back, from people who are shareholders, rightfully so, sitting in Belgium, in Europe, including in South Africa, who say to you, why does it matter who owns the Reserve Bank? But they're the ones who own it, right? Almost like, why should you have interest in this institution and what it does? I had the privilege of speaking to Chris Stolz through emails, and I have a record of that because in academia, you must have some form of writing. And he says he spent the better part of the 80s and the transition getting politicians out of the Reserve Bank, right? He says that. So why do you do that? Because you have to admit, this issue of political will for me has become something I don't understand, and quite often I don't respond to it. There are institutions that operate in the private sector for profit, that if the Reserve Bank conduct its affairs differently, what do I mean by that? If they issue different kind of banking licenses, right? If they regulate the financial sector differently, if they redirect certain kind of investment differently than they do now, you will have a different economy. The Banks Act of 1990, when it was designed, it deliberately excluded the state from applying for a banking license. Who approves the banking license? Is the Reserve Bank. They didn't want the Reserve Bank to be subjected to applications of banking license by the state. We went and we changed that. The Banks Amendment Act now allows public institutions to apply for a banking license. That has been there for the past 7 years. We don't even have a single license issued to a state-owned company. So when we talk about the Reserve Bank, let's not go around it, symbolism, anomaly. There is a serious, tangible feel of a Reserve Bank that operates for the interest of the financial sector. And it's tangible because these companies continue to make profit even when the entire economy is dysfunctional. How do you explain that? Right? Every time Standard Bank CEO Sim Chawala report on the annual outcome of the performance of the bank, it's billions of profits. It's aided by the Reserve Bank. They play part and parcel of that profit. And if we speak about it as if these are two unrelated matters, and we speak about the macro economy and all its function, fiscal and monetary, as if there is no deliberate intention to make profit, we're going to mislead ourselves. Once, not nationalize, transfer the ownership from the current shareholding to the state as the only shareholding. We continue with the conversation of, okay, over and above what you do now, what else can you do? And you can't have this conversation with the current Treasury in its form because they deliberately refuse to engage in that conversation. They have certain ideological underpinnings that allows them to put certain policies and they don't get engaged. You should have seen the shock when the budget was rejected. They couldn't even recalibrate. It took Duncan over a month. He threatened to resign, the DG of the Treasury. So these institutions are not something in the air. These are very tangible institutions that with a different human resource, different ideological underpinnings, a treasury that invites people's power into the discussion about the budget, and the Reserve Bank that does the same, which will have one day a publicly open monetary policy committee meeting. And then you get to see how they arrive at whether we should increase interest rate or not. Those are the institutions that must be democratized. And you can't democratize a privately owned institution. You can't. It's not PSL. There's South African Football Association, which give proper guidance to the PSL and every other football association that is out there. That's how you must think about it. So Ivan Khoza and his committee can go and run PSL, but on top of them, you have SAFA. That's important. Who's on top of the Reserve Bank? It's supposed to be the Treasury, but they're not. Last point, Duma. The ANC Secretary General during the budget crisis came out publicly and admitted that we don't want to interfere as the ANC with the functioning of the Treasury. It's not even talking about the Reserve Bank.
Yeah.
So how do you then go and think that on top of the Reserve Bank there's something else? There's nothing. The Reserve Bank tables its reports to Parliament, but they don't answer questions. It's a fact. They can come there and present an entire hour and they said, no, we'll submit in writing, and they don't answer. If you ask a Minister of Finance a question and says, is the Reserve Bank doing 1, 2, 3, and 4? The Minister of Finance will say, no, I don't answer for the Reserve Bank. So it's beyond anomaly, and we must start to think about these institutions as contested terrain. We can't contest monetary policy on privately owned institutions. The privately owned AGSA, Auditor General, the privately owned Public Protector, privately owned IEC. You can't. You can't do that. You have to have this institution democratized. And democracy means exactly that. The will of everyone else imposed on those institutions when they are publicly owned, not privately owned.
There's also the issue of the composition of the Monetary Policy Committee. In the UK, the Bank of England, they've got external members of the Monetary Policy Committee. Why do we should democratize even the Monetary Policy Committee to have other people making these decisions on interest rates. Yeah.
Sorry, to my last point. Point. You know, this thing that the president appoints directors of the Reserve Bank, therefore, there's an expectation that the state has some control. The ANC says, no, we don't interfere with the treasury. Where they appoint the director general and it's a state department, imagine this board of directors that get appointed by the president. Very far removed from supposedly the economy and the politics of day-to-day functioning of the state. It's even worse. So that mere appointment of directors, for me, it's that symbolism that we must talk about, not the ownership itself.
Okay, sure.
When we say we should nationalize the Reserve Bank, we're essentially not limiting ourselves to the shareholders, all right? We kick those shareholders out, and the people become the owners of that institution.
So we become, as South Africans, become the owners.
We owners, yes.
Public ownership, yeah.
That's right. But when we nationalize, we change quite a number of issues. When we're nationalizing a Reserve Bank, we're essentially nationalizing money. All right? When you nationalize money, it means the state, the people, have control over the issuance of money. Now, the word money is not the Mandela money that we have here, all right? It's something broader. That's why I said the mandate, which it says currency, they're talking of the Mandela money, this value of that. So when we say we nationalize the Reserve Bank, we are essentially saying the money that has to be put in this economy has to come from us, the people, not some unknown persons who dictate what should go, in the country. So that to me is extraordinarily important. We change quite a number of issues where we're nationalizing a Reserve Bank. We change the manner it has to operate, such that even if there's no political will at the Rutuli House, the technocrats at the Reserve Bank must be forced by the nature of this nationalization, the changes in it that says you're not going to use, for example, price stability or as the mandate. So in nationalizing, we just don't talk about the ownership alone. We talk about the technical detail that come with the issuing of money for purposes of development. All right, so I hope that perhaps answers it. So there is indeed significant difference. If you command me as your servant to say I should release money to SMMEs when there's trouble, I'm going to do it. So nationalization is going to include those elements of how the Reserve Bank ought to operate, because then that is the money that the country has at its disposal. Second, independence. Technically, it's supposed to be what we call instrument.
Yes.
Independence. All right? And it means when they're setting up the interest rate, they're debating those main issues. Those are technical issues. All right? The Reserve Bank ought to be independent because it has got technocrats. It's assumed, all right, that it has people who went to school, understand monetary policy, and therefore when they do that, mathematically this will mean this and that and that. That's the independence that we're supposed to talk about. It's not independent of national priorities. It can't. But this Reserve Bank somehow, I don't know whether we agree, it seems as if it's actually independent of you and me. To the extent that is the case, then I'm afraid they are abusing the word independence.
So just to add to that, there's political or goal independence. Nowhere in the world do central banks have that. It is set through democratic process. And they have operational or instrument independence, and that involves the freedom to decide how to achieve the political goals, Yeah. So, Buddy?
Thank you. I think what's important as well is to kind of we could be talking about independence or public control, democratic control of the central bank, which I think is really important. But what's equally important is public and democratic control of our political parties and government, and that's not what we have at the moment, because the way that the political party funding system works in South Africa is that the parties are reliant on private capital. And so a lot of the policies and I think that this is possibly why we're having an issue in South Africa, is that with monetary policy, is that our politicians the political parties themselves are dependent on private capital, and the policies that they implement tend to benefit the people with money. And once you understand the money, that money actually comes from it's a public money is a public.
It's a public good, yeah.
It's a public good, and it's created by the state through the central bank. Then we can actually understand that the political parties shouldn't be dependent on the private sector for funding, and there's no reason why we should allow it. Actually, what should happen is, in my opinion, is that any kind of private donation to a politician or to a political party should be banned, and the political parties should be funded adequately through the state. And it's perfectly possible for that to happen, because it will be less in.
I wanted to ask, and I'm sorry we're recording this, but I hope you can be honest. There are issues around political will, that's a fact, and I agree with everyone here. One way is to get progressive economists like yourselves to start helping us think about alternatives. No? The other is to think about building people's power in ways that are quite robust, thinking about economic and fiscal literacy in real terms as part of us organizing around demands. But we can't build people's power if parliament is stupidly defunct. So I wanted to ask you, you're in formal opposition now, but 70% of government now is in the GNU. Are there experienced, smart, progressive thinkers inside the research units of political parties in our parliament right now? Who's going to help us run these sort of multi-pronged interventions?
Political parties are some of the most resourced institutions intellectually. The shortcoming is, what do you do with that resource, right? You know, when you meet individuals that are in the ANC, including members of the NEC, and you have a conversation about these issues, these are highly intellectual, invested people, you know, and they're supported by advisors, by researchers. Look at the EFF, for example. One of the researchers there, a colleague of mine, is doing a doctorate now on the land question and the law. He's an attorney. He studied this law while he was in parliament, you know. And throughout that journey, this is someone who has 2 master's degrees, right? Who can explain the complex things in the most simplest way. And you find this across. The DA has researchers, the ANC has researchers. But you can produce the research and put it there. Then the question becomes, what do they do with it once it's there? But in terms of the human resource, and you see it with the openness in which we engage academia ourselves. We don't sit in the corners as an EFF researcher, and we engage robustly. Social media, in seminars, and in conferences. And we write academic papers, book chapters. That's what gives me confidence on that part. And I hope I've answered you.
So from what you've been saying, what I'm gathering is there's no alignment of fiscal and monetary policy as it currently stands. And then how do we solve problems? Because sometimes it feels like they're acting counter-purpose, right? So if we're increasing the interest or decreasing the interest rates so people borrow more, that means people are going to get money that they have to pay more debt on, which ultimately benefits banks and our other financial institutions. So yes, they're saying that's going to expand the economy, but then shouldn't that be through government spending then? Because then that isn't such a high rate of money to put into the economy. So I think that's my first one. Is there no sort of alignment on fiscal monetary policy? And it's one thing about nationalizing or privatizing, but it just feels like, are they not sitting there and making decisions? Because any economics course, you see these things are very intricate. And should they not be working with a similar goal in end? And how do we do that? By using open market operations or reserve requirements and that sort of thing. My second thing is, as relates to the Reserve Bank, obviously we know it's privately owned. Who are these shareholders, and is it a profit-making organization? So I don't know, I haven't looked if the financials are available for the South African Reserve Bank. Are they paying out dividends to these shareholders? They're dealing with large amounts of money. And if they're lending to banks so that they have their required reserve requirement, are they not getting interest off these lending? And who is that going to? And that, I guess, goes to why can we not know who the owners of the South African Reserve Bank are because they've got incentive for what happens and if it's private capital? I mean, for me, I've seen this in mining and having worked in mining. There are things which are, I guess, natural resources are supposed to belong to the country and they rent out the rights to mine those natural resources. Then they're sold. If you think of gold, it's all sold to Rand Refinery, which is owned by the 7 biggest mining companies in South Africa. And it's meant to be this sort of mechanism that controls and manages gold sales externally. But if we look at who makes money off that, it is the 7 biggest mining companies that own it together. And how does that work with the South Africa we're trying to create? My next question is in terms of okay, last one. Okay, last one. Okay, no, I know. Okay, yes. In terms of monetary policy and the BRICS, it always seems like a very economic thing. In terms of decentralizing the US dollar as the metric of the economy and what we buy and what we sell, because that seems to where we're borrowing from. And if we're getting high interest rates and borrowing USD, that's a problem for us. How does BRICS work in decentralizing that, especially if we're exporting from other countries that are not the USA? And is there a global move to decentralize that? And how does the Reserve Bank work within that?
I have a very simplistic question, and it's probably directed at Reggie. If we are, I'm Fano. If we are being told that managing the interest rate is the only way to stabilize our currency as well as stabilize inflation, what other monetary policy tools are available? Like I said, I didn't study economics, so I'm trying to understand if this is what we're being sold, what else is available from a monetary policy perspective to manage the currency as well as to stabilize inflation.
For what that lady asked about the owners of the Reserve Bank, the shareholders, we know who they are. I think that they are there. So, for example, Tito Mboweni, I think, bought some shares years ago after he wasn't there. Is it not a way of finding out how much he paid for those shares and then get a sort of some sense of what these shares are worth? Because the sort of common narrative out there is that it's going to be billions and unaffordable to nationalize. That's one of the reasonings.
I know that there is quite an ideological debate about this nationalization, but I just wanted to probe what you were saying about how easy it could be. And I'm going to ask my question by way of example. I was thinking about Niger, a country in West Africa, Sahel region, who then decided in June of this year to nationalize a uranium mine. And France got very upset about that and took this case to, because they previously owned like 65% in this mine. And they need that uranium, obviously, for their nuclear energy. They take this case then to the World Bank's arbitration body, who then rule that Niger may not sell any of that uranium. That mine is about to go bankrupt because, yes, they took a very progressive step to nationalize, but there were all these consequences. So I was just wondering, when you say it's only going to cost 10 million, are you only taking into consideration buying over those shares? What other hidden costs could there be that we need to take into consideration to actually actualize this goal of nationalizing? Thanks.
Thank you so much for such a stimulating discussion. It got very heated. I'll just answer some of the questions. Alignment of fiscal and monetary policy, that's what we said from the beginning. These should be seen as one. For example, the central bank can finance government spending. The central bank can intervene in the bond market. It can reduce the cost of capital. There's so many other things that the central bank can do. The central bank can finance development, finance institutions to be able to lend. The central bank can influence the allocation of credit by the banks. The central bank can set up developmental windows for things like mass housing, for taxis. There's so many other monetary policy tools, and we can discuss them outside. The other monetary policy tools, and then in terms of the hidden costs, I cannot think of any hidden costs because you can pay a premium and say, oh, I know the EFF might not agree, but even if you pay a premium of 100%, then what? That's what I'm saying. And then in terms of the cost, we can talk about this outside. There's a presentation I did to Parliament to explain how this thing works. The shareholders are on the website of the Reserve Bank. You can see them at any given time. There's maximum ownership of 10,000 shares. That's 50,000 rands. The German guy, he's got 10,000 shares, 50,000 rands. the shareholders get a maximum dividend of 200,000. That's all of them.
In
and
total.
the person with 50,000 would get a dividend of slightly less than 1,000. They're clearly not in it for the money, some perverted reason. So I'm just saying that, yeah, it's just a weird thing. It's a weird thing. It's like, and I agree, it's got more than symbolic. Yeah, but we've got to democratize, as Gumani says, the public money. We've got to democratize monetary policy. We've got to have a developmental central bank. And I believe that all progressive, we must now discuss what will a developmental central bank look like in terms of the ownership of the central bank, in terms of the mandate, the rules that Reg is talking about, in terms of the composition of the Monetary Policy Committee. There's no reason why we should only have economists there. Why can't we have people who are not economists there? Why can't we have labor leaders? Why can't we have community leaders on the Monetary Policy Committee? So these are things that we should discuss as a country in terms of this developmental central bank. Thank you so much.
And I hope that you all are more empowered around monetary policy, and you know what they look like. I also just want to, in addition to thanking Duma very much for that, also just advise that part of the reason why we're bringing people together on Sunday afternoons is so that we do get empowered, so that we can engage, not just at parliamentary hearings, but also in forthcoming sessions around the G20. So this is a plug for We the 99% People Summit, which is going to happen at Conhill on the 20th to the 22nd November. And that's where people are going to be encouraged to ask questions, to pose alternatives, and just to finally say that the highlights for that are tax the super rich, tax 1%, end illicit financial flows, transform the debt system, both nationally and globally. Corporate accountability must be enforced, and remaking of multilateralism, investing in climate justice, and recognition and redistribution of care in the economy. And there is a sign up at the camp desk.
dialogue felt different. It felt deliberate in terms of making it family friendly, in the way that we incorporated a kids' corner, in the way that we had kids' laughter and noise, in the way that we had play, and we were able to be mothers in the space while we are doing the work that we are paid to do because of this economy. We need to work, but I found myself bringing the whole of myself to the space for the first time, and I felt myself just enjoying the atmosphere holistically, just having intergenerational ages coming together in one space and occupying it in a very deliberate manner, seeing how adults were taking in the conversation in art and seeing the very same thing with the children and hearing that conversations. I was at the children's corner and they were talking about how their parents are so obsessed with coffee and how yucky coffee is. And the one who said, but have you tried it with milk and sugar, And which was, it's an economic conversation. Your parents are drinking coffee because they don't have the energy and they need the energy boost to do what they need to do to be a parent and to be working. So it was so relevant for 5 and 6 year olds to be having that conversation as we're talking about how the Reserve Bank needs to be nationalized. So today's conversation centered around the nationalization of the Reserve Bank made me realize how almost simple it could be to actually do it, and how but also how difficult it is to make a simple decision in government. It's such, for us, for listening to it, it wouldn't even take a lot of finances to do it. It would just take some sort of an agreement and an understanding. And so, but the system is so big that it's just taking so long. Interested to follow the processes of this type of decisions being made in future.
It's clear from this conversation that what is being contested is to reformulate and reimagine the entire economy. Because people are beginning to appreciate that the economy in itself has a role, and the role is to make everyone's life better. But you can't have that conversation with people who think of the economy as a way to make profit only. You need to have different stakeholders, including those that say, we want this economy to make our life better. Then you get to appreciate that the economy has to do far much broader contribution to everyone's well-being. And that's how you arrive at, are people at the voices from below, are they speaking? What are they saying? What is being contested? Then you can be able to listen to those ones who are saying, no, we need to keep the Reserve Bank as it is. We think it's doing well, being challenged. And it is out of that challenge that the contradictions, the contestations becomes much clearer. And you get winners in the process. And hopefully in future, the winners will be all of us, not just a few in society.
I think we have to demystify economic debates. There must be, in our communities here in Brixton, in other communities, we must be discussing the kind of economy that we want. And I very strongly believe it mustn't just be the so-called experts, the so-called economists. It must be ordinary people who must decide what type of economy that they want. Reimagine this economy, and we have to listen, as Dr. Tshimomola was saying, the voices from below that must have their voices heard as well.
Made me like the space even more, the fact that it was family friendly. I mean, I don't have kids per se, but I do have family and friends with kids, and I do see how this changes their ability to be able to enter a space. So the fact that there is a space that says, hey, your kids can come too, I thought that was really commendable and in fact is important, and it should be something that should be implemented through all aspects of our society. You can't have a discussion without talking about the arts, because whatever you do in this world, you will be listening to the arts, whether it's music, whether it's looking at posters, whether it's looking at how things are designed, the arts are involved. So having a space that is actually like, hey, let's take this seriously, it means, hey, you're actually recognizing what it means to be and live in this world, the arts. So yeah, no, I'm 100% for that.
I think it's the ease of the people, and you know, they it seems as if they were not in some debate. It was as if people were just relaxing, doing, you know, the day-to-day things, but somehow listening to an important issue and then reacting to it. So that ease, I think, is quite important, and perhaps we need a lot more of this than the very formal ones, where people, you know, claimed to understand things, sit and ask questions. But ordinary people ask questions like these ones here. It does make a great deal of sense and a difference as well. I think it is very important. So this is, to me, an area where I think this differs from quite a number of similar events that I've attended. The issue here, to me, was about why we should, in fact, nationalize the Reserve Bank. It seems as if people are a bit confused, or some are concerned why we should nationalize it. Some say we should nationalize it. They really don't seem to connect nationalization with the Reserve Bank and what then that would mean to the ordinary person. So to me, the primary matter here was to respond to people that, well, when you nationalize the Reserve Bank, you are essentially asking the South Africans to direct their monetary affairs themselves, instead of those people whom we do not really know. It cannot be owned by a tiny set of people. It's like saying the government of South Africa should be owned by one person, like Cyril Ramaphosa or stuff like that. That would be crazy. So the primary institution like the Reserve Bank necessarily has to be owned by the people if the blood of the economy is going to be distributed right across the citizens of the country. There isn't a good understanding of what monetary policy is. By extension, therefore, not good understanding of what the Reserve Bank is supposed to be doing. And that, to me, is a worry, given that all of us talk about money all the time, yet we do not really know or understand how that money is created, how it is distributed, and who does that, and why. So this, to me, stands out to be a very important aspect of this activity that we had today.